Hello again, you right? So I'm just going to give you a little introduction again to your work this week on the Haitian Revolution. Okay, so last week you were doing your very short introduction to the topic, and you had to make your little fact files on Toussaint Louverture for your teachers. What we're going to be doing today is looking at the background to what was happening in Haiti before the Haitian Revolution began. Okay, now if you look just on the page here, I've got a title now. At the end of the lecture, you're going to have a few questions to answer from a worksheet, which is attached on the Show My Homework. You can make this the title, and then you can answer the questions. So you can either copy that up and type it and send it to your teachers, or you can handwrite it on a bit of lined paper and then send it to them. Okay, so if you want to copy that down, you can quickly just pause it here. So the title for today's lesson is "Why was Saint Domingue described as the pearl of the French Empire?" Now, the first thing to know, Ure, is that Saint Domingue was the name of Haiti back when it was a colony of France. Okay, so Haiti used to be called Saint Domingue when it was run by France. Obviously, it's a French name. When Haiti eventually gained independence, they obviously wanted to change their name from the French one to one which they thought represented the country in terms of the native people. So they changed the name from Saint Domingue to Haiti. So throughout the lecture today, when I'm talking about Saint Domingue, it is the same place as Haiti, okay, that island we saw in the Caribbean just next to Jamaica last time. Okay, so the question for today's lesson is, why was Saint Domingue described as the pearl of the French Empire? Now, if we just stop and think for a minute, what kind of people do we think of as wearing pearls? Now, I think a few of you have probably thought about, well, pearls are usually worn by very rich people because they're sort of seen as a sign of luxury and expense. And we're also quite often used to the idea of pearls being something precious, because a pearl is something you'll quite often pass down in your family. It's common for people to pass down pearl necklaces in their families because they are so valuable. Now, why might France have described a place as its pearl? Okay, well, thinking about how we think about the idea of pearls today, well, because it was of great wealth and it was also incredibly precious to them, incredibly valuable. Okay, now what we're going to be thinking about today is why that was. Now, one key word, first of all, to make sure you all know, and you might want to write this down if you don't know this one, but that's up to you, is colony. Okay, now Saint Domingue, or Haiti, was a colony of France. Okay, now what is a colony? So a colony is a country which is controlled by a more powerful country. Now, if we just think about that then, so France at that time had a big empire, so it had all these areas of Western Africa, for example, and Vietnam and Cambodia, parts of India, parts of Northeastern America. They were all part of France's empire. So these areas would be considered its colonies, okay? And we're used to the idea of colonies. So if we think about India, for example, India was a colony of Britain for hundreds of years. It was part of Britain's empire. We conquered and ran India as a colony. And likewise, we can think about somewhere like the Ivory Coast was a colony of France, which is why people there speak French to this day, because Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, was a colony of France's. So in the same way that the Ivory Coast was a colony of France's, so was Saint Domingue, and what later became Haiti. They were a colony of France as well. Now, how did the French benefit from controlling Saint Domingue? So why was this little tiny half of an island so important to France? Why was it seen as the pearl of their empire, the most valuable part of it? Now, there were a few reasons for that. The first one, really importantly, was sugar. Okay. Now, Saint Domingue in 1790, just before the Haitian Revolution began, produced 45% of the world's sugar. Now, think about that for a minute. So, nearly half the world's sugar was made on just this island, okay? And remember, in the 18th century, at the time of the Haitian Revolution, sugar was described as white gold, okay? It was called white gold because it was so valuable. At that time, Europe had just begun developing a major sweet tooth. Sugar was in huge demand, okay? So if you could make lots of sugar, you could make lots of money. So Saint Domingue produced 45% of the world's sugar in 1790. And likewise, Only 25% of that sugar was actually used in France. The other 75% was sold to other countries, which obviously made France a huge amount of money from trading the sugar it made in its colony to other European countries, particularly Britain. Now, the other reason that Saint-Domingue was really valuable to France was because of its coffee. So, by 1790, same year, 50% of all of the world's coffee was made in just Saint-Domingue, okay? And at the same time that sugar's getting really popular in France and Europe, so are coffee houses, okay? So coffee houses became a huge thing in France in the 18th century. And it meant that the French people who owned coffee plantations in Saint-Domingue earned huge, huge profits, okay? So that was two key reasons why France benefited from its control of Saint-Domingue: the money they made from sugar and the money they made from coffee. There were also, though, other indirect benefits in France itself. So, for example, there's about 25 million people living in France in 1790, just before the French Revolution, and nearly 1 million of the people in France were in jobs that were tied to trade with Saint-Domingue. So they had a job that relied upon the trade with Saint-Domingue as a colony of France. So that's nearly 4% of the entire country's population relied upon jobs that were tied to the trade with Saint-Domingue. And that would include jobs like working on the docks. So you see in this painting here, when the ships carrying the sugar and the coffee would arrive in France in places like Marseille, they would have to have lots of people who would unload the ships, okay, like our own Docklands in eastern London. The people actually processing the sugar, turning it into the refined, more valuable kind. The people who were paid to build the ships that actually carried it to Saint-Domingue. So there were whole industries that were reliant in France upon the trade with Saint-Domingue as a colony. And likewise, the traders themselves, okay, so the people who actually own the ships, they made huge amounts of money from trading the goods from Saint-Domingue with the rest of the world, okay? So the people who actually owned and carried the goods from Saint-Domingue to the rest of the world made huge amounts of money as traders, okay? And they weren't just wealthy, they were also really powerful. So 15% of the members of France's National Assembly, so if you remember from last half term, the French Revolution, France's National Assembly was like its parliament, okay? Now, when the National Assembly was called, about 15% of the assembly members, the equivalent of MPs here, were merchant traders, people who made their money trading, and many of them had made their money from trading in sugar and coffee coming from Saint-Domingue, okay? So again, you got all the money in France generated by the jobs, but also all the traders who were really economically powerful, but also politically powerful. So, quick recap then. France benefits from Saint-Domingue because of the money it makes from sugar, the money it makes from coffee, all the jobs in France which are created by the trade with Saint-Domingue, and then finally, all of the traders in France who make their fortune through trade with Saint-Domingue. Now, if you have a quick look at this painting here from France in the 1770s, I want you to have a quick look at it. Just have a think for a minute. What are three things you can spot? Just have a quick look at the painting. And just after you've done that, have a little think about what does that suggest about how important the produce, the things made in Saint-Domingue, were to French society. So what are three things you can see in this painting? Now, I suspect a few of you have picked out some things like, for example, so this is a coffee house in France in the 1770s. So you can probably spot down here this person here collecting the coffee grounds from down in the floor here and then being served coffee. We can see all of these people here who are drinking coffee, okay, and they're also having cakes, and we can see a little bit of sugar on the table here. So what does that suggest about how important this stuff was for French society? Well, one thing is about the money it literally makes from selling all that coffee and sugar, but also it's really important to France culturally, okay, that huge parts of French society have gotten used to having coffee houses, they've gotten used to having sugar in their coffee and tea, but also obviously sugar being used to make pastries and all sorts of things. So it's not just about the money that Saint-Domingue brings from making this stuff, it's the way that actually French society has gotten really used to having this cheap supply of coffee and sugar. Now, the other thing to think about is how much do these people here probably think about where their products come from, where their sugar and coffee comes from? Probably not very much. Like today, we're used to the idea that we don't think too much about the conditions in which our trainers are made in. We don't think about where they come from, really. We don't really think about where the food we eat comes from or who made it and how. So many people in France would have been unaware of how all this sugar and coffee they were consuming was made, or at least they didn't really want to think about it too much. And the reason for that is that the place where Saint Domingue's wealth and products came from was from slavery. Okay, so in the case of Saint Domingue, then, right, there are by 1790 about 500,000 slaves growing and producing all of this sugar and coffee. Okay, so Saint Domingue is the single biggest slave colony in all the New World. There are more slaves in Saint Domingue in 1790 than there are in the United States or in Brazil. So it's the biggest slave colony in the world at that point. In total, about 1.2 million Africans were kidnapped and brought to Saint Domingue. Okay, so between 1600 and 1790, that was about 10% of all the slaves that were taken from Africa to the New World were taken to just Saint Domingue. Okay, so 1.2 million Africans were kidnapped and taken to this island. Now, some of you might have spotted from that, well, hang on, there were 500,000 slaves by 1790, but 1.2 million were kidnapped. So what happened to all of those slaves? Well, the point about that was that the conditions on the plantations were so brutal in Saint Domingue that half of the slaves died within 3 years of arriving on the island. So if you were an African who'd been kidnapped, taken into slavery, half of the ones who arrived in Saint Domingue would be dead within 3 years of arrival. Now, you might think, well, kidnapping and paying for those slaves is really expensive. So why would the slave owners not even try a bit harder to try and make sure like less of them died? Okay, and the simple reality was that what the plantation owners in Saint Domingue worked out was that they didn't see the Africans as, you know, fully human. They just saw them as people that they could make money from. They worked out that it was actually cheaper for them to work the slaves to death to try and make as much profits as quickly as possible, and then just replace them with new slaves. So it just shows you how much in Saint Domingue slavery was about money, and it really destroyed any sense of humanity. They calculated that it was cheaper for them to work the slaves to death to maximize the profits they could make from all this sugar and coffee, because there was so much demand for sugar and coffee in France and the rest of Europe at that time. Now, after you finish watching this lecture, remember this is 2.1, this is the lesson. There's a little video clip I'll put in 2.2, which is going to look at the actual conditions that the slaves in Saint Domingue faced to give you a bit of an idea about why the death rate was so high. I think it's also really important for understanding when the Haitian Revolution starts, it's obviously a very, very violent process. Okay, so when these enslaved Africans rise up, they, you know, it's big payback time. Okay, there's serious violence that takes place, and it's really important to understand the conditions that the slaves lived in that led to them carrying out such a violent uprising. Okay, so we're just going to look at a few sources now to get an idea about what conditions on the plantations were like. Now, this picture here to start off with. So this is a engraving from a French encyclopedia in 1751, about 40 years before the Haitian Revolution. And what you can see in the picture here is this is a very advanced milling machine that was used to crush cane stalks to collect the juice that was then driven by a water mill. So for those of you who don't know, the way that you make sugar is that you have sugar cane, which you grow out in the fields. You then collect it, which you can see this person down here doing, and you place it in mills like these. And what then happens is you feed the sugar cane into these mills and you squeeze the sugar cane. So you squeeze all of the juice out of it, which is then boiled to make the kind of sugar that you get in your tea or your coffee and stuff. Okay. Now, this job was incredibly dangerous because what would happen is the slaves who were working, like this woman in the picture here, they would have to delicately load the canes into the milling machine so it could be crushed. Now, they would have to work 7 days a week, 16, 17 hours at a time, okay, with no break. And what would sometimes happen is as the slaves got more and more exhausted and lost concentration, is they would sometimes put their hands into the machine, and then their hand and their arm and the rest of them would then be crushed. Okay, so it was incredibly dangerous working in the mill because of all the accidents that could happen around all this really heavy machinery. Now, this source is from a plantation manager in 1765, again, 25 years before the Haitian Revolution. And what he's actually doing here is he's writing a manual for other slave owners, so other people who own plantations where they grow coffee and sugar. And he's basically advising them in how best to manage their slaves. It's quite a brutal source, but it gives you a real insight into the mindset of the slave owners and plantation managers. Okay, so this is him advising his fellow slave managers the best ways to punish slaves to get the most work out of them. So what does he say? He says, slow punishments make a greater impression than quick or violent ones. Rather than 50 lashes administered in 5 minutes, I recommend 25 lashes of the whip administered in a quarter of an hour. Stop these at intervals to hear the cause which the unfortunate black always pleads in their defence, and resuming the lashing again, continue like this 2 or 3 times to make an impression. The message is aimed as much at the other blacks who are forced to watch as the victims themselves. Again, that's obviously quite a horrific source, but I mean, what you can kind of see from it is how methodical the plantation managers were about managing the slaves. So he says, don't whip them 50 times in 5 minutes, do it 25 times and do it over 15 minutes to make the punishment last longer. And as well as calculating the way to carry out the whipping to have the biggest impact and inflict the most pain, he also talks very, very precisely about the fact that the reason why you're whipping the slaves for not working hard enough or trying to escape or whatever it is, isn't to punish them. It's about the other slaves who are forced to watch, okay, so that they learn from that if they don't follow the rules and work harder, they're going to face the same punishment. So it shows you the mindset of the French plantation owners in terms of trying to squeeze as much work using these horrific punishments out of their slaves as possible. And likewise, we've got a few more here. So this would be slaves who are working in the fields actually collecting the sugarcane. So you can see the whole time they'd be supervised by these plantation managers with whips, and they'd be whipped and punished if they didn't work harder. Slaves were also branded. Okay, so when they arrived in Saint Domingue, their owners would literally emblazon in their arms their initials to show that they were their property. Okay, so they were actually branded with the initials of their owners. Okay. Lots of the slaves were women as well as men, so women would often have to work in the plantation gardens producing food for the community. Also, another really dangerous job in producing sugar was you'd have the sugar cane, which would obviously be cut down in the fields. It would then be taken to these mills where it would be crushed down into juice before what happened after that, where it would be boiled in these big metal vats to then be basically you boil it in these vats until all the liquid disappears, and then you're left behind with the solid sugar, which is what you then process and actually have in things like chocolate and coffee, etc. So that was a really dangerous job working in the sugarcane boiling vats. Okay. Likewise, there was a code in Saint Domingue called the Code Noir, the Black Code, which listed what punishments plantation owners were expected to use against their slaves. The punishment for trying to escape was leg amputation. So slaves would have one of their legs cut off if they tried to escape. If they then tried to escape a second time, they'd be killed. Okay. And here you can see an horrific picture of a punishment mask that was sometimes used. So slaves who were disobedient or spoke back would have to wear these masks as a kind of punishment from their masters. Okay. So France makes a huge amount of money from this trade with Saint Domingue, from its coffee and from its sugar, but all of that wealth is based upon this really, really violent, exploitative system of slavery. Okay, and it's really important to keep that in mind when we look at the beginning of the revolution next week. This is the important context. Okay, this colony is worth a huge amount of money to France, so they're not going to be willing to just hand it over. But equally, when the slave uprising does begin, it's an incredibly violent process because of the violence that they'd faced for hundreds of years on the island at the hands of the French plantation owners. Okay, now there are three things that you have to do for Friday, year 8. Now, the first one is you've got 6 questions here along with a challenge question, which are on the screen here, but they are also in the worksheet, which is attached on Show My Homework, and they're also in Show My Homework. So you need to answer these 6 questions and the challenge question, and then send them to your teacher. So you can either type that up and then email it to them, or you can handwrite it on lined paper, take a picture and send it to them. There's a little super challenge question as well, if you want to have a go at that. So once you've done the questions, you've then got to also, there is a quiz, multiple choice quiz questions, which are on Show My Homework, which you also need to get done for Friday's lesson. Now, the final thing, year 8, is once you've finish this video in a second. Last week, a lot of you didn't watch the follow-up video, so I should have made it clearer that in the playlist you've got for this Haitian Revolution scheme of work, the last lesson you had 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. The other videos you're meant to watch, so the first number is the lesson number, so 1. So last lesson you had 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. All of those videos were to do with that first lesson. So when you finish watching this lecture today, which is 2.1, there is a quick 3 or 4 minute video just underneath it in the playlist, 2.2, which you also need to watch as well. Okay, so a lot of you last week watched the lecture, but you didn't watch the 2 smaller videos afterwards. So you need to make sure today to watch the second follow-up video just below this in the playlist. Okay, so 3 things for Friday: answer these questions, send them to your teacher. 2, make sure you complete that quiz that is set on Show My Homework. And then 3, make sure to watch the short little video underneath looking at the conditions of the slaves in Haiti just before the revolution began. Okay, it's only a 4 or 5 minute video. It's quite powerful, though I think it'll be really useful for you to watch that. Okay, so make sure that is done by 1 p.m. Friday, year 8. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. Next week, we're going to be looking at the beginnings of the slave uprising in Saint Domingue, so the actual beginning of the slave uprising and how it began and why.